So hello, this is Richard and Craig here with our week 4 feedback video. And Craig, this is a big week for a lot of learners.
Yeah, week 4 is an interesting week. It's a very different kind of week. We bring in quite a different dimension to mindfulness. And I think it can be tremendously productive and useful, but also in some ways quite a challenging week as well. So it's got a different flavour to it.
Absolutely. Heartfulness is a big part of mindfulness, but it really opens up a can of worms. And a lot of people made some very interesting comments.
Yeah.
One of which was, of course, around self-criticism and how that for a lot of the learners were saying that's been sort of ingrained since childhood for them. And we do, we sometimes pick up the way that we relate to ourselves. We sometimes do pick it up from our caregivers. If we grow up in a particularly critical environment, we'll take that on and then start to relate to ourselves in that way and then don't even really know we're doing it sometimes.
Yes.
Actually.
And sometimes it's because we've been on the receiving end of criticism or we've just seen other people being very self-critical. Could be our parents or other adults around us while we were young. And we just sort of take on board that kind of pattern of thinking and that sort of kind of attitude to ourselves, and then all of a sudden there it is, and we're an adult, and where did that come from, and what use is it serving?
Yeah.
I think one of the things that some of the learners were mentioning was that self-criticism was seen as a path to self-improvement, and that's a little bit of a two-edged sword, that one.
It is a two-edged sword. I mean, self-criticism has a place. We should be clear about that. People do use it for self-improvement, motivation, to avoid repeating mistakes, even trying to maintain relationships, where you hurt someone's feelings and you're like, oh, you idiot, why did you say that? So it comes from, I think, a good place. It has a good motivation. But if we look at the costs, if we start to notice that it actually activates the fight and flight circuits in the brain and we get flooded with adrenaline and we end up feeling bad, and of course it has implications for self-esteem and self-worth. So there are certainly, I think you're right, it's a double-edged sword.
I sort of sometimes like to draw a distinction between a kind of mindful and discerning appraisal and a kind of a criticism. And what I mean by that is that if we're mindful and we just see a situation, we see our behaviour, we see a response, a way of dealing with a problem, and we find it doesn't work or it wasn't helpful or was... then a mindful response is just to acknowledge and to note that, almost like just with a clear and attentive mind, and just to realise, gee, that didn't work, and to learn something from that and move forward. Whereas the kind of self-criticism tends to be very inward-focused, very self-obsessed, very there's agitation associated with it, and very often wrapped up in amongst that kind of self-criticism are various forms of bias, and we very often take it out on ourselves a lot more than we take it out on others, although we can do that as well. But it tends to be less impartial. It tends to be more sort of ego-laden. And it doesn't necessarily help us learn. Sometimes, in fact, it can just more deeply entrench the very thing that's being criticised. But that impartial awareness, cultivating that ability to be an observer and just noticing, doesn't mean that all of a sudden everything's absolutely fine, but we just notice those things that are problems, but in a kind of a less self-destructive sort of way.
Yes, and there's the research that I think we mentioned actually that students who fail the test and then are self-compassionate actually do better on the retest because they don't waste a whole lot of time beating themselves up, feeling bad about what happened, then sort of avoiding and procrastinating. They just acknowledge what happened, see it clearly, and just get down to work and actually do better on retests.
Yes. And that should be distinguished, I think, from complacency,
yes.
Which is, I dare say, we could get a veneer of self-compassion over the top of a whole lot of complacency and say, oh, just being self-compassionate, I just won't get on with dealing with the problem. But that's not necessarily self-compassion. I think that's using a veneer of self-compassion to just avoid.
Yes. And of course this is happening all throughout the lifespan early on, but also in middle age. So some of our learners were talking about that.
Maybe I could take on the middle age thing.
Well.
So closer to that than you are. I think too it can be either the things that we've done and thought over a long time all of a sudden really come home to roost as life goes on. Sometimes I think as well, as we move into the middle part of our life, which is very often the busiest in terms of work or family and other responsibilities, that kind of pressure and pace of life just puts us into this kind of highly alert, reactive kind of mode. And we've got to get places, we've got so much to do, and somebody, is slow on the road, and all of a sudden there's this reactivity. And And it could be a part of that as well, that criticism of others is just a sort of a sign of this build-up of the intensity and pressure of this fast-paced kind of life that we live. And that pace, I think, is very often at its most in those middle years.
Yes, yeah. And of course, there was also the relationship between self-compassion and some of the other concepts that we raised.
Like self-pity.
Like self-pity, yeah. And actually, they're very different things. Going back to what you were saying before about a clear seeing, when we see clearly what's happening and are kind to ourselves, we still, we still respond to the situation rather than getting caught up in some kind of story about it, some kind of woe is me, self-pity story.
Yes.
And so one of the things that we can see, first of all, with self-compassion is when we are maybe getting caught up in some kind of rumination or story, and of course then just start to, I guess, drop the story and relate, in a more compassionate way to what's actually happening.
Yes, because that narrative, that default sort of mode, and very often those stories of negativity about ourselves are very well rehearsed and go on.
Same with self-indulgence.
Self-indulgence, a favourite, I'm sure that many of our learners would love. Self-indulgence, I'm sure we've indulged in a bit of that. But again, self-indulgence is quite different to the kind of selflessness that's associated with mindfulness. Very often, I think this comes up a lot for carers, and not just professional carers like doctors and allied health professionals, but parents caring for children, or caring for aged relatives and so on. That but wait a sec, I can't take time to care for myself. I can't be kind to myself. I've got too many other things to do. And I think there's a difference between self-care and self-indulgence as well.
Absolutely.
And I think that if we're actually very mindful, we realise that if we don't care for ourselves, it's very hard to turn up and care for others in a more compassionate and open way.
Well, I would say that the way we relate to ourselves is the way we relate to other people. If we're dismissive or unaware, of course, we're going to be like that with other people as well, right?
Yes. So, but self-indulgence, I think, is that when there is a need and we turn away from and ignore the need, and just indulging ourselves, and it's a kind of avoidance as well. But it's not the same as self-care.
No, one of our learners said that after this session, they went away and ate a whole pack of biscuits. And perhaps that's not actually particularly self-compassionate. You're really noticing each biscuit. And the first 5 or 6 might have tasted really good and felt good, but after that you might have started to notice that feeling of fullness.
Well, look, mixing metaphors is always a dangerous thing, but mixing your mindfulness practices, so mixing self-compassion with mindful eating is very dangerous. I find you've just been mindfully eating way too many, generally chocolate biscuits as well. Yeah.
And self-esteem as well differs from self-compassion in the sense that when we're being self-compassionate, we're really just taking care of ourselves first and then by extension taking care of others. But with self-esteem, I think there's a sense of comparing ourselves to others, whether we're trying to do better at something or build our sense of self-worth through achievement or something like that, I think.
Yes. It's an interesting thing. Some of the world's great wisdom traditions have had a lot to say about these kinds of things. And one translation of humility is an absence of self-esteem, which is sort of like, what?
Yeah.
But I think what it
really... in a healthy way.
Yeah, and I think what it means is that very often in our own minds, the internal dialogue, am I better than, worse than, I'm no good, I am good. And this can be quite a battle within ourselves to try and endlessly debate our own merits and so on. Whereas I think the absence of self-esteem just means that the attention's unhooked from the constant preoccupation about ourselves. And that makes it easier to be open to, perhaps when we make a mistake, to be open to criticism, or if something goes well, to acknowledge it without having to cling on to it and make a big deal of it. And that's a kind of an equanimity, I think, for the ego, as a sort of an absence of self-esteem, a lack of preoccupation with self.
And that getting unhooked from all the stories and that preoccupation with a sense of self is really at the heart of self-compassion. That's really what that means.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. And then, of course, by extension, compassion for others.
Yes. You see, and there's a very natural kind of connection. If we can be compassionate to ourselves, then it makes it easier to be compassionate with others. It's very often one of the things I note, even if the topic hasn't come up formally in a course, that very often within a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, people are being a little bit more gentle and kind to themselves. They often say, I'm just being more patient and tolerant of others. I'm just being less reactive. I just notice that gee, they're in the same boat that I'm in, and I understand where my stuff is coming from now, and I understand it more with others.
I notice that all the time as well, actually, that it does begin with us, mindfulness, but then very quickly becomes about other people. And I can't tell you how many times people have been at work and their boss has been giving them some grief, and all of a sudden, rather than reacting, they've just suddenly realised, hang on, maybe my boss is going through something a little bit tough today. Maybe they're a bit stressed, a bit tired.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll respond a little differently to how I might have in the past.
Yeah, they've got a lot on their plate, and just noticing all their fears and concerns about something like that. And so
Yes.
I think that's a very important part of what it means to be aware in a broader sense of the world, where that awareness sort of ripples out, which is, I think, very important.
Yeah, well, on that note, some learners noted that it was obviously much easier to do this with friends and colleagues than it was with, particularly close family or people that you might have more history with, or sometimes with strangers or people that you have conflict or difficulties with. And you sometimes hear about people talking about circles of compassion, so it maybe begins with us and then maybe ripples out to the people who it's easiest to be understanding and compassionate with, and then maybe ripples out a little further. And of course it's a practice, isn't it, of really changing our relationship with ourselves and others and allowing that to spread out across the pond.
Yes, it is a paradox, though, that very often the people that are closest to us can be sometimes the most difficult to be understanding and compassionate. And I think that is because when we're closest, those attachments are stronger, and very often means that the love can be stronger, but sometimes when that flips, the opposite reaction can be stronger as well.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of loosening up of those attachments, which doesn't mean a disconnecting, but an ability to feel connected to somebody or at one with somebody, but without being caught up in that relationship. And that can be a very helpful thing to do. But our relationship with ourselves ultimately is, I think, probably the trickiest, because that's closest to home.
And that's where it begins, of course.
Yes. An issue that's come up as well is empathy fatigue, or there are a lot of terms used around this, compassion fatigue or carer fatigue and so on. But when we're in a situation where we do connect and feel for others, if we get caught up in that suffering, then very often it feels very burdensome for ourselves as well. And if we're around that a lot, it can feel overwhelming. I think that to defend ourselves from that, very often we either try and wall off, cut off and get removed. And sometimes that can turn into being cold and, say, for a health practitioner, clinical and so on.
It happens a lot in medical training, doesn't it?
It does.
People getting told to care less or just to protect
toughen
themselves,
up.
toughen up.
Or we just get overwhelmed and just can't cope anymore. And I think there's a very important ability to be able to be in the presence of difficulty or suffering, but without getting caught up in it. And when we're sitting in our chair practicing meditation day by day, we're often in the presence of our own suffering. And it's not always comfortable, but if we can be aware of it, not caught up in it, just observing it, letting it be, learning to be at peace with the stuff that we find very disquieting, then I think it makes it easier to be in the presence of somebody else who's suffering, but not being so agitated by that. But I think that takes a little bit of time, that sort of equanimity.
Yes. And sometimes active compassion's good too, sometimes even just to make wishes for others to be happy, or to, I like the advice of looking for the helpers. Whenever I watch the news, I'm always looking for the helpers, the people who are cleaning up the rubble or filming things or exposing things or trying to make a difference. Yeah. And often we'd miss that. So just noticing that can be also a very helpful thing.
I think a really good stepping stone towards that is to notice that when we're giving our attention to thoughts inwardly and emotions that are intensely critical of others, or maybe have some sort of harmful intent for others. And if we notice we're feeding our attention to that, we'll reinforce that kind of attitude as well. And at very least, just noticing whether that's helping or not, and you may find that it's not, an unhooking from that, I think is very important, rather than keeping on feeding that.
Yes. Something else that was difficult for a lot of the learners was cultivating self-compassion in the face of difficulties. Yes. It's one thing to sort of cultivate this in meditation, but then of course when things are tough, we tend to revert to those familiar patterns of self-criticism and harsh self-judgment. And so of course that's the challenge. That's where the rubber hits the road, when we really need to apply this stuff. There's no correct experience. I guess that's one thing that we'd love to stress, that there's really no right or wrong way of practicing mindfulness or practicing self-compassion. And in fact, quite often when we have this counterpoint of self-compassion and this relationship and this idea that we could relate differently to ourselves and others, we start to notice how much we're not doing that. Just like when people first start practicing mindfulness, one of the first things they start to recognize is that their mind is very distracted and scattered a lot of the time. And it can seem like it's making things worse, but it's really not. It's showing them what's already happening.
Yeah, I think it's very important to be gentle with the way that we work with this. So there were clearly some profound experiences and very positive ones with the loving kindness meditation and so on. There were clearly some very challenging examples. It's very important, I think, to just work with the things, like lifting weights, starting with the lighter weights and so on.
And building up.
Because to really be able to cultivate compassion for others in situations that are really have got a lot of history to them is not easy at all. So just those little things and working up to that. But at very least, mindfulness is going to make us aware of things. It's like in the Matrix, taking the red pill and seeing how deep the rabbit hole goes. I think mindfulness does show us those kinds of things. So even in the presence of our own irritation and so on, we need to cultivate compassion for ourselves.
Absolutely.
And it takes time, it takes patience.
Yeah, and heartfulness is almost sometimes like taking a second red pill, I think, because, sometimes people can use mindfulness to avoid certain emotional experiences. It can become another avoidance pattern.
Yes.
Don't focus on it, somehow just avoid it without realizing we're doing it.
Yes.
But the moment we start to cultivate something like loving kindness or become aware of emotions in the body, we can't avoid them anymore, really. And so I think from reading through what a lot of the learners were saying, there's a deepening of practice that might have happened this week, where they're really starting to sense what was already there beneath the surface, that really needs to be addressed in a mindful and self-compassionate way.
Yeah. Sometimes it comes up in groups. Oh, look, do I have to forgive somebody? And look, I don't think the message here is have to forgive, have to. But what we can do is also just bring some awareness to the lack of forgiveness or the effect of resentment, and in a non-judgmental kind of way, to actually just notice the preoccupation that causes, the effect it has on ourselves. And I think that's an important sort of step in the process.
Just that awareness can be a very powerful thing.
So just very briefly, some learners felt that there was a kind of prayerful component to some of these loving kindness and compassion meditations, in the kind of way there is, that these kinds of things have been practiced for thousands of years. And we need to practice what we feel comfortable to do, and some learners might feel less comfortable, maybe in a month, 6 months, 5 years from now might feel comfortable or feel a need to practice these kinds of exercises. So we each go at our own pace in our own way.
It's a natural state of mind, self-compassion, loving kindness. These are not things we create, they're things that we get in touch with through the various practices. But like everything in the course, we'd invite learners just to experiment and find what works and what doesn't, and if things are just not right for you, then just leave them and move on to the next.
Yeah. And just very briefly, another question to come up about being anxious, making us more alert. And I think that there's a difference between being mindful and alert and being stressed and alarmed. Because the stressed, very often we make errors and bad judgments. The being alert is very helpful. And the kind of relaxation associated with apathy is very different to the kind of inner calmness associated with being very alert and present and engaged. That way, we're both safe, but also feel better in the meantime.
I think of elite sports people like Novak Djokovic. He used to worry about the outcome of a match, and that would actually make him crumble under pressure.
Take the focus off the ball.
That's right. Literally take the eye off the ball, and of course that wasn't working very well for him. So mindfulness has helped him to let go of that, just to be in the moment, focus on what's happening, and of course seems to be working for him.
Good. All right. Well, look, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We did, yes. So once again, thank you to all the learners for their great contributions and the discussions that are happening there, and we look forward to seeing what comes up in the next week.